From the News Channel 5 Network, this is Inside Politics.
Hello, everyone. I'm News Channel 5's political analyst, Pat Nolan. Welcome to Inside Politics. The midterm congressional elections are just over a month away, with early voting beginning in just a few weeks. Who's got the outlook in terms of what the control is going to be over the U.S. House and Senate? What about the statewide races in Tennessee? And, of course, there's the ever-controversial nomination of Brett Kavanaugh to the United States Supreme Court. Nobody knows Congress better than Vanderbilt professor Bruce Oppenheimer. He's our guest again on Inside Politics today. Professor, it's been an interesting week, to say the least.
Yes, and each day gets a little more interesting.
Yeah, let me say as we begin this conversation, particularly about the Kavanaugh nomination, that we are doing this conversation before the Friday deadlines that could determine whether the Judiciary Committee has a hearing about this, whether there's going to be an FBI investigation, et cetera, et cetera. It does seem to me in the back and forth between the committee, the person who's making the accusations, and the Democrats to some degree, there's been a search for the high ground in terms of politics and in terms of public relations. Who's winning that race so far? It looks like the Republicans have positioned themselves pretty well. Well,
it depends who's affected afterward, not right now.
You say who wins the nomination, or what happens to the nomination could be inverse.
Right. That is, the losers on the nomination fight may be the winners politically, and the winners on the nomination fight could be losers politically. And this is true on lots of issues. We find that the losing side gets more mobilized, gets more up in arms on a contentious issue, and the winning side feels a little more satisfied with what went on. So that if Kavanaugh is denied confirmation, you could see that Republicans might use it more effectively in close Senate races against Democratic contenders, and saying they would not have supported Kavanaugh. On the other hand, if Kavanaugh is confirmed, you might see women voters more sensitized to these issues and be more prone to vote for Democrats.
How would you break that down into Tennessee? At this particular point, Marsha Blackburn has said that she first thought this whole effort for these accusations coming out about the sexual assault was basically a smear job and a delay tactic. She wants the votes to go on as soon as possible. Phil Bredesen has been sort of like, well, that's what they have these hearings for. They need to look at this and have a chance to hear from her, sort of following along with what Senator Bob Corker, who currently holds the seat, has been doing. How does your scenario work out with them?
Well, I'm not quite sure, but one thing I think is important is, does it mobilize groups? Does it lead to higher or lower turnout in Tennessee among different groups of voters? That's important in midterms, because turnout is lower in midterms than in presidential election years. And the lower turnout is, the more likely that one side or the other can get an advantage in turnout.
In the most recent poll I saw from CNN between Bredesen and Blackburn, he had almost 20-point lead among women. That's a pretty large lead. Can it get any larger than that at this point?
I don't know. I'm not sure what that will look like. I'm less worried about, I would be less worried if I were the Blackburn campaign about the size, although size is important, than about whether women voters are going to be mobilized in a midterm at a much higher level than they normally would be.
So does Bredesen also stand some kind of a risk? He has not taken a position one way or the other about Kavanaugh. He has sort of said, his last statement about it was, well, the hearings have been kind of a circus, which sort of falls into him running against Washington, not necessarily against Republicans or against President Trump. Does he have to be careful how because ultimately he's going to have to take a stand about whether Kavanaugh is a good choice or not a good choice. If he says it's a good choice, doesn't he hurt his standing with voters no matter how the nomination turns out?
He may.
With women voters?
He may, or they may consider him the only option. So I think that's a very real question. Can he have his cake and eat it too?
For Representative Blackburn, she has said that the Supreme Court is a very important issue for Republicans. That was certainly true in 2016 for President Trump. He says it's the issue that helped get him elected. In her particular situation, because Tennessee is such a red state, don't the Republicans likely to be motivated no matter which way this nomination goes?
Well, the evidence on nationwide polls, and I haven't seen them in Tennessee, is that Democratic voters this year are more motivated than Republican voters. And in wave elections of the past, that has been an important predictor of who does well and who doesn't do well. But Bredesen has to overcome the Republican lean It's more than a lien in the state. And the question is whether whatever size wave it is hits Tennessee strongly enough that Bredesen can do that.
Looking back in history, you were around when Clarence Thomas had his hearings and Anita Hill made her accusations, in that case about sexual harassment.
Right.
How is this particular situation different? How is it the same from 27 years ago?
Wow. I think there are some similarities. It came up rather later in hearings. The question, there has been an effort to attack in some ways both of the women involved, which is problematic. There are two important differences in Congress. One, the Democrats were the majority party at the time with the Republican president, and all the members of the Judiciary Committee were men. And
right now, all the Republican members,
all the Republicans are men. The Republicans are in control, and so that may make a difference. And there are Democratic women on the committee. How
do you see the growing impact of the Me Too movement having on this? Is this getting more credibility in terms of the committee being willing to have some kind of hearing, although the technicalities of that are still up in the air? Does this make it a stronger movement just because of how strong the Me Too movement has emerged in the country?
I think undoubtedly. The context of the times are different. The expectation of what is appropriate behavior by men is different. The willingness to believe women who make charges of sexual indiscretion or sexual assault are different than they were in 1991.
Supreme Court nominations used to get 85, 90 votes, maybe more than that, out of the 100-member Senate. We don't see that anymore. They're becoming much more knockdown, drag out, fight to the end kind of battles. She's the person making the accusations, Christine Blasey Ford, says that her life has been threatened. She's had to move her family. She's had problems online, being hacked and impersonated. Obviously, Justice Kavanaugh feels like he's having equal kind of problems with these accusations being leveled against him. Is this what the Founding Fathers had in mind when they said the Senate should advise and consent on Supreme Court nominations?
Well, politics has gotten rougher. And I think over our history, we have found times where the Senate has been more or less collegial, and where Congress has been more or less collegial, where partisanship has reached real extremes, and where it has subsided. And I'd like to think this is a rough patch that will subside at some point, that some issues will come across that will cut across party differences, but it's not happening soon.
These accusations going back into a time when people are in high school, this would seem to be sort of going into a slightly different new territory. If going back to the Anita Hill thing, that happened 10 years before this particular hearings, but both people involved were in their adult professional years. Now we're talking about things that went on during high school. Is that a troubling new area to go into in terms of looking at the totality of somebody's life for a nomination?
I think that's for individuals to judge. I think that's a difficult question. But certainly in this day and age, you may, and especially if you're going to be on the U.S. Supreme Court, or you have goals of being on the U.S. Supreme Court, your behavior throughout your life may be important. It is saying that, in fact, we may go over things that at one point people would not have concerned themselves with, but which are of concern in today's context.
One quick last question on this segment. Would we be better off if the Supreme Court went to set term limits like 16 years rather than lifetime appointments? Would that end some of this politics?
No, I don't think that would end things. And in fact, you would then have more justices to replace. And one of the problems is you would get rid of good justices too soon, and bad justices would stay too long.
Dr. Bruce Oppenheimer from Vanderbilt University is our guest. We're talking about what's going on in Washington this week. Of course, there's an election coming up, too. Back to talk about that on both a national and Tennessee level after this break.